Last week we finished chapter 10 of Matthew, and it's kind of one of those moments where, we got a few of them through the book of Matthew, but it's like some of those, hard statements that Jesus makes about who God is and, what God's about and what the power of God. And he made this incredible statement, and it was to his disciples. Because you remember, all through chapter 10 that we've been going through, Jesus was talking to his disciples, and he was preparing them to go out into the community and to do ministry. That's what all of chapter 10 was about. But we got to the end of chapter 10, and Jesus makes a kind of a crazy statement. It's a hard statement, but he's like, all these people might do stuff to you. All these people might come out against you. He's like, don't fear them. He's like, don't fear people that can just kill your body. He's like, fear God, who has the power over your body and soul. He even went so far as to say, and it's true. He says that, God has the power to destroy a body and soul in hell. And it's like, that's a really hard statement. A lot of times, we shy away from making hard statements about the power of God and who God is, but that's the reality. And it's like, the whole point in seeing that is we should really take him seriously. But I think even when Jesus was explaining this to his disciples as they were going out, it was just a perspective shift. It's like if you're more worried about what God thinks, you're more worried about what comes later with him, if you're more concerned about his kingdom and his outlook on your life, you're going to be less concerned and less bothered by everything that people do. People can do and say and everything that they want and all types of stuff. They may even hurt you physically. But it's like when you frame it differently by, I'm more concerned about what God thinks, then all the stuff that people do doesn't matter as much because you see how amazing, how awesome God is, and his opinion just means that much more. So I think Jesus was preparing his disciples, say, you guys are going to go out and you're going to face a whole bunch of people problems. But just worry about at the end of the day what God thinks about all of it. Because at the end of the day, you're going to stand before him. You're not going to be standing before these people. These people are going to stand before him too. But you're going to be standing before him. Worry about what he thinks. Everything else that people do going to mean a lot less. So that's what Jesus was sharing with his disciples last week. We looked at that. We came very much to the understanding of please don't take God lightly. Again, it's kind of a scary thing when Jesus makes those statements, but it's real and we have to pay attention to it. But simultaneously, we must know that, again, he's awesome. He's wonderful. Where would we be without him? But don't ever think we should take him lightly. That was the talk last week. He's God. There's nobody else like him. That was the end of chapter 10. That was the end of Jesus' talk with his disciples. That leads us into chapter 11 this morning. And chapter 11, we're going to read the first 19 verses of chapter 11 of Matthew. And so, starting in verse 1 of chapter 11, it says, "Now it came to pass, when Jesus finished commanding his 12 disciples, that he departed from there to teach and to preach in their cities. And when John had heard in prison about the works of Christ, he sent 2 of his disciples and said to him, 'Are you the coming one, or do we look for another?' Jesus answered and said to them, 'Go and tell John the things which you hear and see. The blind see, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. The dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. And blessed is he who is not offended because of me.' As they departed, Jesus began to say to the multitudes concerning John, 'What did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? But what did you go out to see? A man clothed in soft garments? Indeed, those who wear soft clothing are in the king's houses. But what did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I say to you, and more than a prophet. For this is he of whom it is written, Behold, I send a messenger before your face, who will prepare your way before you. Assuredly, I say to you, among those born of women, there has not risen one greater than John the Baptist. But he who is the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. And from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the violent shall take it by force. For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John. And if you are willing to receive it, he is Elijah who is to come. He who has ears, let him hear. But what shall I liken this generation? It is like children sitting in the marketplace and calling to their companions and saying, We played the flute for you, but you didn't dance. We mourned for you, and you did not lament. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say, he is a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, look, a glutton and a winebibber, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. But wisdom is justified by her children. A lot of different things that Jesus says here, but let's work through it a little bit. I said the last 3 weeks, Jesus was having this talk with his disciples. We see in verse 1 here, they're kind of going separate ways. Like, Jesus had been the example to them. He had been teaching them. He had been showing them firsthand what he's all about as he's been out in the community. At this moment here in chapter 11, the disciples go their way. They're out in the community. They're out doing ministry. And Jesus still is on the same mission trail as well. He's out in the community too, still doing stuff. So we see that, all of chapter 10 built up to this. But then we come into verse 2. Like, they had gone their separate ways and Jesus was out doing stuff. But then we see kind of the main event of this passage in verse 2 and kind of where we're going to camp from. So they separated, but then verse 2 happens. It says, and when John had heard in prison about the works of Christ, he sent 2 of his disciples to Jesus. John sends 2 of his disciples to Jesus. And we saw later in the passage, and just so we're clear, that this John that is referenced here is John the Baptist. So this is John the Baptist who is sending some of his followers to go question Jesus, to have a question for Jesus. If you remember back, like it was all the way back in chapter 4 of Matthew. Chapter 4 was the moment we heard that John was arrested. John was arrested and he was imprisoned. And it's believed that his arrest really happened because he was kind of calling out the sin of the leader at that time. Obviously John was doing all types of stuff to, try to rub people the wrong way. But I think one of the key things is he called out the leader at that time on some really sinful. I think he took his sister-in-law as his wife or something like that from his brother, something like that. John was calling that out, and then he ended up being in prison for it. And so he's been sitting in prison this whole time. I think sometimes we get to this point, it's easy to like, oh yeah, John the Baptist was at the beginning of the story. Like, he's still in the story. He's just been sitting in prison all of this time up to this point. But we see, as it says here, that John has been in prison and he's been hearing about the works of Christ. And that's something that's interesting to think about. Because like I said, John went into prison. Like when you read Matthew 4, John went into prison basically the exact moment that Jesus started his ministry. Like obviously he was there and him and John met and everything, but Jesus didn't start his ministry really until like the moment that John went to prison. So John wasn't there firsthand. John wasn't following Jesus around and seeing what was going on. They weren't really like side by side in ministry at all. John was obviously there to lead the way, but John hasn't seen anything that Jesus has been doing firsthand. He's just been hearing the reports back to his prison cell. That's how this has been working so far. So that's a little context for this, for what this, what's happening right now. So he's been hearing about the works of Christ from his prison cell. He sends 2 of the guys that are still following him, and they come to ask a really interesting question of Jesus. And we see that in verse 3. So these disciples, they come to Jesus and they say, are you the coming one, or do we need to look for another? I think when we read this, I'm like, I feel like that's kind of weird. Like I think if we don't, like, and we're going to talk about the context of this a little bit, but if we don't understand the context, it's like, John, like, why are you sending guys to Jesus to ask, like, oh, are you the one? Or are we looking for the next guy? Like, it seems like kind of a weird situation. Like, why is this question being asked? Like, we think of John the Baptist. Like, John the Baptist literally had the opportunity to baptize Jesus. We talked about why that went down, but he baptized Jesus. He saw the Spirit of God descend on Jesus. He heard God the Father speak from heaven and say, this is my beloved Son. Like, John, you saw all these things. Like, why are you sending these guys to ask? Like, are you the guy? Like, you should know he's the guy. But there's reasons why. And so why this question? Why is John sending these guys to ask this question? And there's some debate as to why this is happening. Like some people debate, like, is John the one asking the question? Do John's disciples just ask the question when they get there? Some people even think that, John is sending these guys to ask the question so that they can get an answer firsthand from Jesus. Like, don't let me tell you, go ask him yourself. So, like, there's a couple different ways that, people kind of look at this moment. But anyway, any way that goes, any one of those options, I guess, why the question? Why is there this question in place? Like, why are they, like, even if you guys are just following John and you hear what John's saying, it's like, why are you questioning what Jesus is? John's the one that's supposed to be leading the way to Jesus. Why is this question in play? But this question is really, it's the result of misunderstanding. It's the result of misconceptions. Like, people had misconceptions about how Jesus was going to come and what he was going to do. And this question really is the result of that. There was a general idea at that time and in Jewish culture that the Messiah was going to come. The Messiah was going to come as a political leader, or he was going to come as like a military leader. And he was basically going to like either overthrow the government, or he was going to like take the country from the oppressors by military force. Like, that's what they were expecting. They were expecting, a politician or like a general. And they were expecting him to come and just take care of business in some big, dramatic, political, military way and free them out of oppression. Like, that's what they were expecting. So when Jesus is just out, ministering to people and serving people, they're like, are you the guy? Like, we thought this is how but again, we thought that this is how you were coming, not necessarily based on like the ultimate truth of why Jesus was coming this time. It was just their preconceived notions. Like, it was their misconceptions. Like, there is some truth to what they're saying that is still coming in the future, even right now, but it wasn't what was intended for that moment when Jesus was coming. We saw Jesus coming. We've seen it all through the book of Matthew so far as we've been going through this. We even saw that Jesus came in great humility. Like, he didn't come as like, I'm the leader, I'm the king, I'm the ruler, I'm the politician, I'm the general. He didn't come like that. He came humble. He came as a little baby. He came born in like an animal like feed shed, and like he came humble. And even as he's walked, he was born to regular people. He worked a manual labor job in carpentry. Like, he came humble. And even as he started his ministry, like, again, there's been big miraculous moments. He's taught incredible, like, only God can teach things. But his ministry is still like at the individual level. It's serving the individual. It's healing the individual. It's helping the people. It's loving the people. It's caring. It's like it's not been the big political push. It hasn't been the I've gathered my army. It's been Jesus ground level in the trenches, helping people. Like, that's what his ministry has been, and obviously teaching and preaching and everything as well. But again, they expected one thing. And the thing that they expected wasn't the thing that was happening. And so that leads to this question, like, all of our expectations were this. Obviously, you're not lining up with that. So are you the guy or not? Like, is things going to change? Like, are you going to start doing this stuff right now? Are we stepping up the game here? Like, are we going to take this more seriously? Like, I mean, it's like, I don't know what they're thinking, but again, like, based on what they thought and what they saw, there was a question in their mind of, Jesus, are you the guy? Again, we don't know if the question sort of like roots from John, but again, it might be understandable because John hasn't even seen Jesus firsthand in ministry. The guy's been sitting in a prison cell. And it's like, his followers, I don't know, maybe John's been trying to teach him, but John's like, I haven't even seen firsthand. Go see it for yourself. And so it's like that obviously there is this question that is in play. But Jesus responds to their question. They say, are you the coming one, or do we look for another? And then we see verses 4-6. Jesus answers them. He answers them and says, go and tell John the things which you hear and see. The blind see, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. The dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. and blessed is he who is not offended because of me. It's interesting to see here, Jesus he doesn't even give him a yes or no answer. Like, he doesn't say, yeah, it's me. Like, he doesn't do that. But he tells them, he says, go tell John. Again, John's sitting in prison. Go tell John what you see and what you hear. You've seen the miraculous. You have heard even more about the miraculous. Even if you weren't there, you still heard about the miraculous things that are going on. That John hasn't had the chance to see these things with his own eyes. But Jesus is like, go tell him. Go tell him about the things that you're hearing and that you're seeing. He said Jesus didn't say, yes, I am the guy. But what he did say really is, look at the evidence. Look at the evidence that is in front of you. Look at what you see. Consider what you're hearing. Look at the evidence. Does the evidence answer your question? It's like, I don't need to say, yes, I'm the guy, because the evidence really proves I'm the guy. Tell them, go look at the evidence. Consider it. What conclusion should you come to based on the evidence? Jesus says, blind people see. Lame people now walk. Diseased people are now healed. Deaf people now hear. Even dead people have come back to life. And the poor are hearing the good news of the gospel and the kingdom of God. He said all of these things are happening, and they're happening right now. The evidence is right in front of you. You can ask me a question. It's like, I really don't need to give you a direct answer, because the evidence and the answer to your question is right in front of you. It makes me think, because, every day I go to work, and I work in a very, it's not really glamorous, really, but at the end of the day, my job is supposed to be a very science-based job. Every day it's the evaluation of, for us, it's the evaluation of the evidence of crime. That's what we do every day, but it's a scientific evaluation of the evidence of crime. But we look at the evidence. We look at the evidence to determine the truth, or if we can't see the whole truth, to determine any facts that we can from the evidence. We look at the evidence, and we just take it for what it is. We see everything that's going into it, and we determine, can we see the entire truth, or can we at least see some facts of the truth that are based in that evidence? We look at the evidence to get an answer. Jesus was like, here's some evidence. What do you get from it? That's what he's doing. He says, here is the evidence. You've heard it, you've seen it. You should have an answer to your question based on the evidence. And that ended the conversation. Hopefully, they understood that answer immediately. I think they did, because that ended the conversation, and these guys were right on their way back to go tell John about it. And it's interesting. It really is that it's like, obviously the conversation ends with the disciples, John's disciples, and those guys are headed off back to go to report to John. But it's interesting in this moment that even when these guys are taking off, that Jesus is going to take a moment, and he's going to really look at the multitudes that are all around him. He's going to actually talk about John for a moment. Like, it's this is Jesus. And he's like, the disciples of John come and ask him some questions, and Jesus is going to take this opportunity to talk about John to other people. And it's interesting to see what he says. So let's read again verses 7 through 15. And this is right after John's disciples leave. It says, as they departed, Jesus began to say to the multitudes concerning John, like, what did you go out into the wilderness to see? Did you go to see just a reed shaken by the wind? But what did you go out to see? A man clothed in soft garments? Indeed, those who wear soft clothing are in the king's houses. But what did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I say to you, more than a prophet. For this is he of whom it is written, behold, I send my messenger before your face who will prepare the way for you. Assuredly, I say to you, among those born of women there has not risen one greater than John the Baptist. But he who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. And from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the violent take it by force. For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John. And if you're willing to receive it, he is Elijah who is to come. He who has ears, let them hear. We're not going to break down every word of this, but Jesus obviously speaks very highly of John the Baptist. He's like, you guys went and you saw John. He's like, you didn't just go out into, like, they went out to the river. Obviously, John was usually teaching at the river out there and out in the deserts and at the river. And he's like, you didn't just, like, there's millions of reeds by the river. You didn't just go out to see one of the millions of reeds. You went out to see this guy. You went out for a reason. You didn't just go out to see anyone. You went to see something different. You just didn't go to see some guy in some fancy clothes. You went to see some guy that was dressed crazy. like he was, he was an interesting character. He says that you guys went out to see a prophet. And he says, and it's very specific to John. He said you didn't see somebody that was more than a prophet. Like, there was a lot of prophets all through the Old Testament. There was a lot of prophets. But John was the only one that was the prophesied, like, messenger and the person that was leading the way for Jesus. He was the only one. He was preparing the way for the Messiah. But Jesus makes an incredible statement. He spoke very highly of John, which is cool, and in what it is, I'll talk about that in a minute too. But then he makes a statement in verse 11, and he says, but he who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than John. Like, he spoke the world of John. He's like, there's not another person born of a woman on this earth that is greater than John the Baptist. But he who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than John. And that's an interesting point. And what do we take from that? And there's a perspective that we need to know here, we need to understand, is that everything prior to Jesus dying on the cross, all of time for humanity prior to Jesus dying on the cross, was under the old covenant, God's old covenant with Israel. There was a difference, a different way God interacted with man differently under the old covenant. He was the same God, but he interacted with people differently under the old covenant. That's like with the sacrificial system and all of those things. But once Jesus died, that ushered in the new covenant between God and man. And it changed everything. It changed absolutely everything. The crazy thing is, John lived and died before the new covenant ever started. John died before Jesus died. We're going to read about that eventually in Matthew. But Jesus' death and burial and resurrection changed everything. The reason why, and that includes us, the least of the kingdom of heaven, the reason why we, like Jesus would say, are greater, in a greater position than John the Baptist, is because we started on a higher footing than John the Baptist. John the Baptist lived under the old covenant, and it was a completely different relation between God and man. For us, like every single one of us, because of what Jesus has done, we start on a higher platform and a higher footing than John ever had. And it's incredible for us. It is. It doesn't diminish at all who John was, but Jesus is bringing to reality like how big of a change is coming through his work and in the ushering in of the new covenant. So we've been moved up from the lower ground of just being on the law to now being on the much higher ground of the grace of God. That's where we get to start from. It's only by God's grace, and it's only because of what Jesus has done. Jesus changed absolutely everything. But even as Jesus continues to explain John, Jesus explains John as the end of an era. And it's interesting too. John was the last of the prophets, at least for that time. John was like, there's people now that still like to try to take the title of prophet and the office of prophet. But if we hear what Jesus is saying, like John was the last of the prophets. Now there's a different thing with the gift of prophecy, and that's a whole other thing that we won't go into right now. And I think that's very misunderstood as well. But John was the last of the prophets. Jesus identifies that. Here was the end of an era. But it's so interesting to think because every prophet that came before John, every single one of them was saying, the Messiah is coming. Every prophet, like all of what they said, everything that they did, all through the Old Testament was, the Messiah is coming. You go to Isaiah and all these guys, the Messiah is coming at some point. John was the first and the last prophet that was able to say the Messiah is here. Like, he had a completely different role. He was the end of an era. The Messiah is here. And now he still had questions, perhaps. Are you the guy? I mean, but he's the first one that gets to say the Messiah is here. And Jesus goes into some other things that, again, not necessarily things we need to break down at this moment, because he says, until Elijah who is to come. And so when we look at that, when we look at the time gaps, like right now we're living in the time where we're obviously after John the Baptist. But there's also a time coming, and it's in the book of Revelation, where it talks about the witnesses that are going to come and really before the second coming of Christ. And that is believed to be when the prophet Elijah will once again come back to this earth and be part of that leading of the way of Christ to come the second time. But that hasn't come. That hasn't happened yet. So John was the end of this era, and there's still one era to come where there will be prophets in play again. But right now, John was the last one for this time. And Jesus makes some interesting statements in regards to this. Like I said, he talked about John being the end of this era and him being the last one. But he says that even during this time, even when John is here, and even as this era continues, and even as Jesus is teaching right now, Jesus makes this comment about the kingdom of heaven suffering violence and the violent taking it by force. It's what we've talked about. It's kind of what we've been talking about. Is that Jesus never brings the easy expectation of what it will mean for his kingdom people, and that it's obviously the workings of the world and of Satan and all these things, there's opposition. There's always going to be great opposition to Jesus' movement forward in this world. There always will be. Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is suffering violence. His kingdom, his people that he's brought in. John was right in the middle of the suffering of violence for the kingdom of heaven. And he will face it even more dramatically in a couple chapters, because John will eventually lose his life for this. And many of these guys will. We talked about last week, all these disciples go out. 11 of them are going to die for it. The kingdom of heaven is suffering violence. Jesus is just real talk about these things. Jesus' people will not always be welcomed with open arms. That's what we've talked about. People will be facing consequences for following Jesus. That's what Jesus is talking about. But I just love, even in this moment, like I said, we wouldn't even break down every aspect of what Jesus said about John. But I like that Jesus does it, I think, even as a great example of leadership. Because great leadership isn't just everybody look at me. Everybody should look at Jesus. He absolutely deserves everybody's 100% attention. But even in a great leadership example, he's like, this is a really good guy too. This guy has done great things. He's been used for great purposes. He has been called for a purpose. He has been gifted for a purpose. Jesus is building up John and building up John's reputation too. Like I said, great leadership doesn't just say, everybody look at me. Great leadership builds up other people. Jesus is doing that. I mean, obviously, Jesus is a great leader. He's Jesus. He's the guy. He is a great leader. But I love the example of the leader of Jesus Christ still building up the workers around him. He's still, speaking well of and building up the reputation and the people around him, because that's what great leadership does. So, Jesus spoke very highly of John, and we get to the last few verses here. And this is really where I think we turn to the very practical application for us today. Verses 16 through 19. Jesus says, "But what shall I liken this generation? It is like children sitting in the marketplaces and calling to their companions and saying, 'We played the flute for you, and you did not dance. We mourned for you, and you did not lament.' For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say, 'He has a demon.' The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, 'Look, a glutton and a winebibber, a friend of tax collectors and sinners.' But wisdom is justified by her children." Jesus just considers the people of that current generation. But I think this is probably applicable to any generation. This kind of falls in line with what we talked about earlier, with people having misconceptions and misunderstandings, or maybe even just expectations, and my expectations aren't being met. That's what Jesus is kind of talking about here. But Jesus says he looks at this generation, and he looks at them as, and it's like everybody, all the people. He's like, guys, it's like a bunch of like children that are just sitting in the marketplace, and we do this one thing. We play the flutes because maybe you wanted the flutes to be played, and now you're not dancing. It's like now it's a time for mourning, and we're going to mourn with you, but you're not going to mourn with us. Like you say these things about John. John came in this way. He was out in the desert, kind of crazy, dressed different, ate crazy things. Like he had a message and a way about him. It's like, you guys said he was a demon. He's like, Jesus came the exact opposite way, and he actually was, hanging out with people and eating and drinking with people, and he was in the midst of people. He was a friend of tax collectors and sinners, and people were like, well, this guy's got problems too. It's like, Jesus is like, you guys got all these different opinions, and you got all these different outlooks, but no matter what direction, even if they're completely opposite things, you still are coming to a problem. It's just like, but that's just kind of how people are. Like people will find a problem in anything. Like literally anything. Jesus is like, John came totally different than I came. I came totally different than John came. You got a problem with both of us. It's like, maybe the problem's you. Jesus is like, you guys are like a bunch of kids. You don't even know what you want. And then when you get something, it's just like, you still don't know what you want, and you're complaining about it. They're like, oh no, he's a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Like, we've already seen that. People were already doing that to him. There's these two totally different guys, totally different, like even the things, the way that Jesus explains them. Like I said, Jesus is just making the point that even in the opposites, even between John and Jesus, like I said, people have their expectations and people have their preconceived notions. And if things don't line up to just their personal thoughts, then they're going to find problems with it. But I think that's for us, and what we need to be learning from this, and what we are learning from this, is sometimes like our thoughts and our preconceived notions of sometimes those things need to get thrown out the door, because we just need to think. We need to see the evidence. We need to understand the truth, and we need to see him for who he really is. Jesus, going through this, he's like, you guys are like a bunch of children. You don't even know what you want. But Jesus says in verse 19 that wisdom is justified by her children, which is just a really interesting way of saying what Jesus kind of already told the guys earlier. He said, look at the evidence. Does the evidence prove that Jesus is the real thing? Wisdom is justified by her children. Like the results that you should be seeing is justifying the wisdom that you should have. The results, the evidence prove what the wisdom is, that Jesus is exactly who he says he is. So people might not know what they want. They might respond weird. We might have responded weird at times. We may have thought different things. We may have had totally different thought processes even about Jesus. But when we see the evidence, what conclusion do we come to? I hope that in everything that we have seen, and even as we've just gone through Matthew so far, I hope we definitively, without any question, without any reservations, come to the conclusion that Jesus is the Messiah, that he is the coming one, as they asked. But from where we're sitting right now, he already came and he already did, and he's still doing. They were kind of like right on that first part of it. We have a lot more evidence from where we sit right now. But all of the evidence, even historically, of course, scripturally, and I also think very practically, I hope, look at your own life. Like, look at the lives of people you know around you that know Jesus. Like, has he changed things? Has he transformed things? Has he fixed things in us? Like, if you look at the evidence, does the evidence say that he is who he says he is? I know for me that it does. No question. No question at all. It's the point that Jesus is making through this entire thing. And it's very important for us as an individual that we know who he is. I do want to look at one just other passage. It's in the book of Luke. Just a few books to the right. Luke 9. want to look at something. Because even these guys, even the guys that were talked to through all of chapter 10, they get to a point where Jesus challenges even them. Like, who am I? Like, he challenges his disciples. Like, who do you say that I am? I want to see this in Luke 9, and we're going to read 18 through 20 of Luke 9. Because it's so important for us. So verse 18 of Luke 9, it says, "And it happened, as he was alone praying, that his disciples joined him, and he asked them, saying, 'Who do the crowds say that I am?'" Jesus is asking his disciples, "Who do the crowd say that I am?" So they answered and said, "John the Baptist. But some say Elijah, and others say one of the old prophets has risen again." And then he said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" It says, and Peter answered and said, "The Christ of God," the Messiah. That was Peter's response to Jesus. Jesus stops his disciples. He's like, "Who is everybody saying that I am?" It's crazy. It's like some people saying he's John the Baptist. It's like, they're very different. Like Jesus has talked about them being different. But people are like, he must be John the Baptist, or he must be Elijah. He must be one of these other prophets. Like there was all of these misconceptions, like all these misunderstandings of who Jesus was. Like Jesus is like, guys, you guys are hearing the crowds. You guys are hearing what they're saying. Like, what are they saying about me? And the reality was that a lot of people did not understand who he was. And so Jesus stopped the people closest to him. It's like, well, who do you say that I am? Peter's the only, obviously the only answer we have is Peter's. But Peter got the right answer. He said, "You are the Christ," or "You are the Messiah." So like I said, it's very important that we know who he is, because lots of people don't understand who Jesus is. Even John the Baptist and his followers, it seemed like there was some difficulty in their understanding of who Jesus was. Obviously, lots of people were struggling to come to this understanding. For us, we have to know. Like, we have to know that Jesus, for one, he's God. He absolutely is. He's God who came in the form of a man. He came as the Savior of sinners. Came to save us. He died on a cross for our sins. He was buried and he rose again. And in his rising, he now invites us to share in his eternal life. That's who Jesus is. And there's a lot more than that. But that's the simple base foundation of who Jesus is in relation to us. And we'll continue to build from that. But we have to start on those right foundations. Like, we have to actually understand who he is. Like I said, there's all these people even that were like contemporary to Jesus. They were seeing some of these things, like hearing some of these things, and they didn't understand who he was yet. There's a lot of misconceptions out there about Jesus. And personally, that's like one of the reasons why I really wanted to go through the book of Matthew, is hopefully to break down a lot of those misconceptions, to break down a lot of those misunderstandings. I want us to see the evidence. I want us to hear his words. I want us to see the accounts of his works, to see the miraculous. I want to see how he walked, how he talked, how he treated people, what he was about, what his purposes were. I want to hear him teach. Said even John and his followers were struggling a little bit. Obviously, a bunch of other people were too. I think that there's a lot of people today that have huge misconceptions of who Jesus is. My hope for us is that we can see firsthand through Scripture. We can break down the misconceptions. Know who Jesus really is. Because we have to know who he really is to follow him for real. You can follow down all types of other paths, like there's all types of paths. Like Jesus is just here for your monetary benefit. Like he's just here to give you money and make you happy and all these things. Like, no, like he blesses his people, but he's not about those little things of just material blessings. Like he stands for so much more than that. Like Some people are like, Jesus is just part of my knowledge and he's storybook Jesus. No, he's not just storybook Jesus and I just learned stuff about him. Like, and there's people that have misconceptions of like even, like, gosh, I think of even like the big ones of like, like blonde-haired or brown-haired, blue-eyed, white-skinned Jesus. Like, that's a huge misconception. It's like, that's not Jesus. Like Jesus wasn't like some European dude walking around in the Middle Eastern desert. Like, he wasn't. So, but there's just so many misconceptions about who he is and what he stands for. But we have to know who he really is if we're actually going to follow him. So we're going through this book to hopefully break all those things down. Jesus was breaking these things down for these people so that they could follow him for real. So let's pray.